It's very difficult to take the ANC seriously on land reform because it has given mixed messages for the past 30 years. It has always had the power to expropriate land in order to promote the public interest, to resolve the problem of dispossession and landlessness. And so far, it has not shown any seriousness in that regard. The primary reason why the ANC was established was not only to unite Africans, but it was to give them a platform to fight against dispossession. So when you have such a crucial and central element to the struggle, it's actually disappointing that a piece of legislation that should have in fact been central to transformation is simply designed and used as political football. I mean, if you look at how the politicians have positioned this bill, I was watching yesterday the Deputy President. The way they've positioned this bill is that this is the instrument for transformation of property relations. But that is just simply a misleading claim. So this notion that expropriation, land reform is actually bad for the economy is actually self-serving, and it is said by people who, in the current crisis that we currently face, today we face a crisis, despite the fact that we've got a market-driven land ownership policy. In fact, a lot of the time people misread Section 25. They regard it as a property clause. You know, it's actually an anti-property clause. At the time the bill was being debated, you could clearly see that there were signals that what was important to the politicians was the symbolic value of this act and not the substantive impact that the act would have. Just like now, I mean, if you look at how the politicians have positioned this bill, I was watching yesterday the Deputy President. The way they've positioned this bill is that this is the instrument for transformation of property relations. But that is just simply a misleading claim. For the most part, more than 90% of this bill, it is a repetition of the 1975 Expropriation Act in relation to its processes that have to be followed in order to effect an expropriation. The changes are actually minor. The changes relate to the introduction of the dimension of public interest. And that specific clause that has got everybody's back up, particularly property owners, which empowers the state in appropriate instances to expropriate subject to nil compensation. Yeah. But the question whether expropriation should happen or not has been part of our legal landscape for hundreds of years. The only difference now is that there are instances that are defined, and those instances include a nil compensation. The primary reason why the ANC was established was not only to unite Africans, but it was to give them a platform to fight against dispossession. So when you have such a crucial and central element to the struggle, it's actually disappointing that a piece of legislation that should have in fact been central to transformation is simply designed and used as political football. It's very difficult to take the ANC seriously on land reform because it has given mixed messages for the past 30 years. It has always had the power to expropriate land in order to promote the public interest, to resolve the problem of dispossession and landlessness. And so far, it has not shown any seriousness in that regard. That's number one. The second thing is that this is not the bill. This is not the act to achieve land reform. It has still not passed the act that it should pass in order to address land reform. The ANC, you will remember, passed a resolution in its last conference, 2022, in which it said that there shall be a land redistribution bill. We are now in 2025. It's 3 years later. There are no signals of the land redistribution bill, but it is one of their resolutions. So I don't trust that there is enough political commitment to resolve land reform. Take a drive from here to Bloemfontein or from Bloemfontein to the Eastern Cape. You see so much land that's lying fallow. Or go to Cape Town to the wine farms, so much land that's lying fallow. And it is in the hands of white people. So the concept of acquiring land for speculation is an old capitalist notion. Now, what you really want to do insofar as land is concerned is to put land into productive use. Right? the concentration of land, and that's the crisis that South Africa faces, it's that it's got an over-concentration of land ownership to a tiny minority. That is what needs to be disrupted. Because if you disrupt that concentration and allow for wider participation into the land economy, that's where you, in fact, can stimulate economic growth. So this notion that expropriation, land reform is actually bad for the economy is actually self-serving. And it is said by people who, in the current crisis that we currently face, today we face a crisis, despite the fact that we've got a market-driven land ownership policy. There are so many instances of land being given to emerging black farmers who are doing excellently, who are involved in the export market, who are involved in resolving the crisis of food shortages in this country. So one cannot make that generic point. There is a different problem, right? There's a different problem, which is the inability of the state to provide what we call post-settlement support, right? Now, that problem must be resolved, but it must not be used as an excuse not to do land reform. What the Constitution provides in Section 25, in fact, a lot of the time people misread Section 25. They regard it as a property clause. You know, it's actually an anti-property clause. The Constitution, Section 25, creates the power to expropriate, right? So that much is clear. But secondly, it also creates the conditions for the expropriation. On the conditions, we've already touched upon public interest and public purpose, so those concepts are now clear. But it makes it subject to compensation. Now, here is where the debate is. So those who insist that there must be money always paid, they focus too much on that clause, you know, subject to compensation. But what they don't do, they don't look at the words that come thereafter, which is what kind of compensation are we dealing with? And that compensation is just and equitable. So which means what is actually the controlling portion in that section is what does justice and equity require in a specific instance. So I usually make these two examples. Take a white man who has received land as a consequence of inheritance, but we can trace from the arrival of Jan van Riebeeck that this land was acquired improperly by violence, conquest, theft, everything that is associated with colonialism. But they're not using the land, they're living in Germany. But around that area is a large community that is plainly landless and is in need of housing. In those instances, the bill would enable the state to acquire that land subject to nil compensation because it's not productively used, right? Or it has been abandoned. Someone is just not caring for it at all. Or take a different example where I would say market value is justified. Take the community of Xolobeni. What has happened is the Australians have discovered titanium in that area, right? So they want to mine it, but they can't mine because there's a community living there. But it is a black community that is the subject of historical dispossession. The question is, do you pay them anything? And how do you calculate? So I would say if you want to remove them in order to make way for a mining activity, then you should pay them. Justice and equity will demand that you pay them market value. So that's why it's absolutely important not to have a one-size-fits-all when it comes to compensation, but to have a scale that would ask the question, what does justice and equity require? So what the bill enables, what the Act, you've corrected me there, what the Act enables the judges to do is that they should take my Xolobeni example and pay market-based compensation, and then they should take my German property owner example and pay nil compensation because that is what is required by justice and equity. So it's perfectly compatible with the Constitution, at least on that score. Section 25 was one of the most contentious sections when the Constitution was debated. And there were three areas of contention. One was, should the state have the power to expropriate, right? Which the National Party and the Democratic Party opposed and they lost. The second area of contention was, should there be the right of return, right? Where you have lost your property rights, should you be entitled to return? Many constitutions across the world do not have the right of return, right? But we inscribed it, it's in the law, right? You are entitled to return to where your forefathers were if you could show that you were dispossessed after 1913. 1913 is a contentious area, but there's a right of return. And then the third one was, in the case of expropriation, what should be the benchmark for the payment? Some constitutions in the world inscribe market value, others do not. We went with those constitutions that do not. And again, even that was contentious. So when Section 25 was therefore adopted, what happened really is that it became the instrument for land reform. That was the purpose behind Section 25. What has happened is that over time, it's been restrictively and conservatively interpreted.
Yeah.
But in itself, the goal of Section 25 is to transform property relations. There are concepts that are not clear. There are concepts that at face value appear to stand in conflict with each other. But the biggest problem I find with the Act is how procedural it is. It is a highly complex, highly procedural piece of legislation that actually makes it very, very difficult for the state to do its job. I think the design of this Act is so bad that it's going to take a long, long time before the state can do its land, to acquire land even for public purposes. Do they have we have to see what the complaint is. I saw that one complaint was that there was not enough number of provinces that supported it, but that depends on what the evidence is. But I think that most people will say what they're objecting to is the nil compensation part. Now, on that score, I honestly think they will fail. I always have a problem when there is a qualification that will not compromise the productive use of land, because the assumption is that as soon as you do land reform, you are going to undermine the productive use of land. Whereas we actually have a crisis now. We don't have a productive use of land despite the market-driven system that we've adopted. So what do we need right now? Firstly, we've got land claims. There are 5,800 claims. They need to be resolved. And when I looked at the plan by the government, it looks like we have another 10 years to resolve these claims. We don't have the 10 years. We have to resolve them now. Second thing is the ANC must do what it promised to do. It needs to pass the land redistribution bill. It can pass it. Let's debate it now. And then the third thing is actually simple. It needs to pass a regulatory framework that will define with more precision the question of compensation, because that is what is really getting a lot of debate.